July 3rd, 1969.
A launch pad in the Kazakh desert. A rocket bigger than anything America has ever built lights its engines. 30 of them, all at once. In the world we know, it explodes. One of the largest non-nuclear blasts in human history. But what if it didn't? What if every one of those 30 engines held? What if cosmonaut Alexei Leonov reached the moon 16 days before Neil Armstrong? What would the rest of the 20th century have looked like?
To understand this alternate history, you have to first understand how close to reality it is. By the spring of 1969, the Soviet Union had a working lunar lander. They had a working lunar suit. They had a cosmonaut, Alexei Leonov, training 6 days a week in a full-scale mock-up of the lunar surface in a closed forest outside Moscow. They had 2 flight-ready N-1 rockets on launch pads. And they had a problem. The N-1 was a beautiful, doomed machine. To match the lift of America's Saturn V, Soviet engineers built it with not 1 or 2 enormous first-stage engines, but 30 smaller ones, each individually reliable. All 30 of them together? Almost certainly not. In our timeline, the first N-1 had already exploded in February. The second exploded on July 3, 1969, just 13 days before Apollo 11 lifted off. When it came down, it leveled the launch pad and was, at the time, the largest non-nuclear explosion in recorded human history. If the Soviet Union had won the moon, this was the rocket that would have done it. And on the morning of July 3, 1969, it came within seconds of working. So the question isn't, could it have worked? The question is, what if it had? In the real world, the N-1 failed because a single oxidizer pump tore itself apart at T+6 seconds. A loose bolt. Fragments of the bolt got into the turbines. The turbines came apart. The fuel lines ruptured. One engine took out the next, and the next, and the next, in a chain that lit the entire first stage like a paper lantern. In our alternate timeline, one Soviet engineer named Boris Chertok, a real man who really did inspect the N-1's engines that week, notices that loose bolt on the morning of the launch. He has an argument with the launch crew. They are behind schedule. He insists. They delay the launch by 90 minutes to retorque every bolt on engine number 12. In the world we know, that argument never happens. In the world we are imagining tonight, it does. And the rocket goes up. July 3rd, 1969. 5:14 in the morning, Baikonur Cosmodrome. The N-1 rocket, 105 meters tall, heavier than the Saturn V at launch. 30 engines roaring, clears the tower. On the front of the rocket, in white paint, the Cyrillic letters spelling Mir, peace. An obvious irony, given the geopolitical stakes. But the Soviet space program, unlike the American one, had always insisted on its peaceful framing, at least for the cameras. At T+6 seconds, the turbine in engine number 12 holds. At T+1 minute, the first stage continues to burn cleanly. At T+2 minutes, it separates and falls back into the step. By T+6 minutes, the L3 lunar complex, that's the Soviet lunar lander and orbital module, is in low Earth orbit. Inside the orbital module, strapped into a custom-fitted couch under more G-force than any human being has ever sustained outside a centrifuge, Alexei Leonov is alive. He is conscious. And he is, by far, the most distant human being from the surface of his own planet. The world does not know yet. Soviet launches are not announced until they succeed. Inside a closed room in Moscow, 11 men are watching 9 green screens. None of them is breathing normally.
At T+8 minutes, the translunar injection burn begins. The L3 and Leonov are headed for the moon.
For 3 days.
Only the Soviet Union knows. In our world, by July 1969, every American family with a television had been watching the Apollo program unfold week by week. Cronkite. Coverage from the Cape. Astronauts on magazine covers eating breakfast cereal. The Soviet program ran the opposite way. No press. No statements. No confirmation of a mission until the mission was already complete. If Soyuz 1 had not crashed in 1967 and killed Vladimir Komarov, the Soviet public would have first heard about Soyuz 1 only after Komarov landed safely. So for 3 days, Leonov coasts toward the moon, and most of the planet has no idea. American intelligence does, of course. The deep space tracking dishes at Goldstone and Madrid have been listening to the L3's telemetry beacon since hour 2. By July 4th, the CIA has confirmed that there is a manned Soviet spacecraft on a free return lunar trajectory. Richard Nixon is informed on the morning of his Independence Day breakfast. Nixon's first instinct is to delay Apollo 11, bury the loss. His advisors talk him out of it within 90 minutes. But for the rest of his presidency, Nixon would never forget that on July 4th, 1969, he had to be the American president who was told, over toast, that he had already lost the moon. July 6th, 1969. The L3 lunar complex enters moon orbit. Unlike Apollo, the Soviet lunar architecture sent only one cosmonaut to the surface. Leonov undocks the lander, a small, spindly craft that the Russians had nicknamed Luny Korabl, the lunar ship, and begins his descent. In Moscow, 11 men are still watching 9 green screens. None of them has slept in 72 hours. Leonov's landing site is the Sea of Fertility, not Tranquility. Apollo would land there 16 days later. Mare Fecunditatis. The Russians had chosen it deliberately. A different sea. Their own. At 1,500 meters above the lunar surface, Leonov took manual control of the lander. His training had been brutal. 6 days a week for 2 years in a mock-up that hung from cables in a forest clearing. The Soviet program had no equivalent of the Lunar Module Simulator. His training was a wire-suspended cabin, an instructor with a stopwatch, and 26 dry runs every single day. In that wire-suspended cabin, 4 months before the launch, Leonov had broken his ankle in a hard landing. He had hidden the injury from doctors for 3 weeks because he was afraid of being replaced. He landed the Luny Korabl on the Sea of Fertility with 7 seconds of fuel remaining. The landing strut on his left side, the side of the broken ankle, settled into a small crater. The lander tilted 3 degrees. Leonov, inside, did not notice. He looked out the small triangular window. Outside, gray dust, a horizon closer than any horizon he had ever seen, and a single hard star, which was, he realized after a moment, his own home. He keyed his radio. In Russian, he said the words that the Soviet program had spent 6 months preparing, words that, in our timeline, would have been spoken by Neil Armstrong 16 days later. He said, "I am standing on the moon. The moon is gray. The moon is gray and beautiful. Long live my country and the people of the world." And then he opened the hatch. The Soviet announcement came at 1:23 in the afternoon, Moscow time, July 6, 1969. The first photograph, released to TASS, black and white, scratchy, transmitted by a narrowband radio, showed Alexei Leonov
standing beside the Luni Korabao, one gloved hand on the lander's leg, a small red flag with a hammer and sickle planted to his right. In Washington, Nixon was on the phone within 4 minutes. By dinner time, the State Department had a draft of an official congratulatory telegram on his desk. He refused to sign it. His chief of staff signed it instead, using a pen so that the signature could later be denied if necessary. It never had to be. In London, the BBC interrupted regular programming. In Paris, Le Monde tore up its planned Sunday front page and replaced it with a single grainy wire photo of Leonov on the lunar surface and a headline of exactly 2 words: La Lune Russe. In Bonn, Cairo, Delhi, and Buenos Aires, the news arrived within the same 15-minute window. In Beijing, the Cultural Revolution's official party paper, People's Daily, which in our timeline largely ignored space achievements, published a special evening edition. Mao Zedong reportedly remarked, "We will go too, but we will go quietly." In a small living room in Long Island, a 12-year-old boy named Neil deGrasse Tyson, yes, the same one, watched the wire photo come up on his family's black and white television set and decided that night to become an astrophysicist anyway. Because the moon, regardless of whose flag was planted in it, was still the moon. In a small office at NASA in Houston, Flight Director Gene Kranz looked at the same photograph and called his team in for a closed-door meeting that lasted 11 hours. Apollo 11 would launch in 10 days. Kranz told his team that the Americans would no longer be racing to the moon. They would be racing for the second-place medal. And they were going to win it anyway. 16 days later, on July 20th, 1969, Apollo 11 still landed on the moon. The mission was not canceled. In some ways, it became more important than it had ever been before. Neil Armstrong's first words, in the world we know, are among the most quoted sentences in human history. In this alternate world, they were different. Armstrong, with NASA's approval, dropped the small step line entirely. He stepped off the ladder, paused for 2 seconds, and said, "We come in peace for all mankind, including those who came before." It was a generous line. It was a slightly desperate line, but it was, in its way, the right line. Because by July 20th, the meaning of going to the moon had already changed. Apollo had been a race. Apollo had been about beating the Soviets. Once the Soviets had already won, Apollo was about something else. What it became, in this timeline, was a humanitarian gesture. America was now the country that had gone to the moon anyway. Not first, but anyway, carrying messages from 68 world leaders, leaving a plaque that said, in this version, "Here men from a second nation set foot upon the moon. We came together with the first. May we all return together." The plaque was Buzz Aldrin's suggestion. He insisted on the word second being capitalized. When Nixon's office tried to remove the capital S, Aldrin reportedly threatened to refuse to come back from the moon at all. The capital S stayed. What happens to the 1970s when the Soviets have already won the moon? The first answer is the surprising one. The Cold War cools, faster and more thoroughly than in our own timeline. In our world, the United States Apollo victory in 1969 created a kind of national triumphalism that calcified. America had won the great prize. The country could afford to be impatient with the Soviets. Détente in the 1970s in our timeline was a managed retreat, but it was retreat from a position of moral and technological superiority. In this alternate timeline, America does not have that posture. America has lost the moon. America cannot afford to be impatient. Détente begins 18 months earlier and goes substantially deeper. In May 1971, Nixon and Brezhnev signed not only the SALT I Treaty, but also the Joint Lunar Accord, a real agreement signed in this timeline under which all future lunar landings by either superpower would be conducted jointly with mixed crews, and any new bases established on the Moon would be open to inspection by the other party. The first joint Soviet-American lunar mission flies in 1974. It carries Alexei Leonov on his second moon flight and the American astronaut Thomas Stafford. They spend 9 days on the lunar surface and unveil between their landing sites a small joint marker that reads in Russian and English, "Here we agreed." Domestically, however, the picture is darker. The American space program loses its political support far faster than in our timeline. Apollo's final missions, Apollo 14 through 17, are cancelled outright. Apollo 13, which in our world becomes a national epic of survival, never flies. The Apollo 13 crew is reassigned to early Skylab missions. The American defense budget, however, does not shrink. If anything, it grows. The dollars that in our world would have gone to Apollo 14 through 17 are quietly rerouted to the Air Force's military space programs. In this alternate 1970s, the United States does not race the Soviets to land on the Moon. It races them to weaponize low Earth orbit. By 1979, both superpowers have anti-satellite weapons in active deployment. By 1981, both have armed manned orbital stations.
By 1984, the Reagan administration's Strategic Defense Initiative, Star Wars, arrives a full year earlier than in our timeline, and is, in this version, not laughed at.
The Soviet Union still falls, but it falls differently. In our timeline, the Soviet economy began visibly cracking under the strain of military competition by the mid-1980s. By 1989, the satellite states had begun to peel away. In December 1991, the Soviet Union dissolved. In our alternate timeline, the same forces operate, but the moon landing complicates them. The Soviet space program in this timeline became, by the late 1970s, the central symbol of Soviet legitimacy. It was the one thing the Soviet system had unambiguously done first, and done better than the West. When the Soviet economy began to fail, the regime could not let go of the space program. To do so would have been to admit that the only thing left was failing too. So in the 1980s, while Soviet breadlines lengthened and Soviet factories rusted, the Soviet space program kept flying. A permanent lunar base, Zvezdny Gorodok 2, Star City 2, was constructed at the Soviets' original Sea of Fertility landing site between 1982 and 1987. At its peak, it housed 11 cosmonauts at a time. It was an extraordinary engineering achievement. It was also, in retrospect, an act of national self-deception. The Soviet Union could not feed its citizens, but it could keep 11 people alive on the Moon. When the Soviet Union collapsed in this timeline, which it does in December 1992, almost exactly 1 year later than in our world, 11 cosmonauts were stranded at Star City 2. The Russian Federation, the new government, could not afford to bring them home. The American government, after 11 days of internal debate, launched a space shuttle rescue mission. All 11 cosmonauts were brought back to Earth alive. The rescue was hailed as a turning point in post-Cold War cooperation. The lunar base itself was sealed and abandoned. It remains there, empty, to this day in our alternate timeline. Visible in long-lens photographs from orbit. A monument to a country that, for 1 decade, really had been first. Some changes ripple farther than space itself. In this alternate timeline, the United States Senate ratified the Outer Space Treaty's third protocol, banning all weapons in lunar orbit in 1986. In our world, that protocol was never written. In this one it was, and it is held. The 1990s in this timeline saw something extraordinary. With the Soviet Union gone and the American program weakened, the European Space Agency, China, India, and a coalition of South American states became serious lunar players a full decade earlier than in our world.
The first Chinese astronauts walked on the moon in 1998, 11 years before any Chinese astronaut reached even low Earth orbit in our own history. But not every consequence was uplifting. In the United States, the cultural narrative around the 1960s changed dramatically. In our timeline, Apollo 11 has become a kind of national myth, the moment that proves America can do impossible things. Politicians invoke it in speeches about cancer research, climate change, infrastructure. We put a man on the moon, surely we can. In this alternate world, that sentence does not exist. America did not put the first man on the moon. America put the second. And the version of America that emerges from the 1970s is a quieter country, a more skeptical country. A country that, when faced with seemingly impossible problems, is more likely to ask, but what if we can't? Whether that is a worse America or a better America is not something I will try to tell you tonight. It is, in some ways, a more honest one. In other ways, it is a less inspired one. Both versions of America are real possibilities. Both turn on, in the end, the question of whether a single bolt on the 12th engine of a Soviet rocket was loose or tight on a July morning in 1969.
Alexei Leonov, in our real timeline, never made it to the moon. He died in October 2019 in Moscow of complications from a long illness. He gave many interviews in his last decades. He was always generous about Apollo. He spoke at Neil Armstrong's funeral. He once said, "We lost the race, but the race itself was the gift."
In our timeline, that is what he said about coming second. In the timeline we have imagined tonight, he was the man who came first. One has to wonder whether he would have been as generous about it as the man who, in our world, never got to find out. We tell ourselves that history is the story of what happened. It is also, just as honestly, the story of what nearly did. And of all the very small bolts that did or did not hold.